everyone, and welcome to the Directors Colloquium Summer Series presented by the Office of the Chief Scientist here at NASA Ames Research Center. This is the 9th in the series for the summer. Today we are exploring the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA, the predecessor agency to NASA. The NACA is the DNA of NASA. This year, NASA is celebrating the centenary of the NACA. 100 years ago, March 3, 1915, on the eve of World War I, Congress established the NACA to reassert American leadership in aeronautics. Over the ensuing 4 decades, NACA research drove the growth of American aviation and then laid the foundation for America's leap into space. In 1958, the 4 NACA laboratories, Ames, Lewis, Langley, and the research station in the California high desert, formed the nucleus of NASA. In addition, NACA people spread out to form the core technical staff of the 4 new NASA centers in Florida, Texas, and Maryland. Today, the NACA heritage within NASA remains strong. That is especially true in the first day in NASA, aeronautics research, where NASA continues to look years ahead and develop new technologies to support the entire aviation industry, as in green aircraft technologies and more efficient means of air traffic control. In discussions of space policy, the early NACA support of commercial aviation has been seen as an analogy to how the government can support commercial space activities moving forward. Still, even though the NACA was considered a remarkably effective government agency, there's much debate over what made it so successful. Today, we are delighted to have 3 legends talk with us about their experience with the NACA and about the enduring importance of the NACA. At the far end, we have Walter Vincenti. Even though Walter lived 3 blocks from the Caltech campus, he decided to go to Stanford and earned his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering in 1938, and then his engineer's degree in 1940. If you're doing the math in your head, he just turned 98 in April. On June 1st, 1940, just over 75 years ago, Walter joined the Ames Aeronautical Laboratory as the 4th engineer on staff, after Jack Parson, Harvey Allen, and Carlton Bialetti. He started by building wind tunnels and gained a sterling reputation in expansion joints and reinforced concrete. In the decade after the war, Walter did pioneering theoretical and experimental work in high-speed aerodynamics, pushing flight from the supersonic realm into the hypersonic. In 1957, in the aftermath of Sputnik and new government funding for education, he was recruited by Stanford to teach in their newly invigorated Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. In 1971, he co-founded Stanford's program in Science, Technology, and Society and enjoyed a second career as a leading historian of technology. His award-winning book of case studies, titled What Engineers Know and How They Know It, is really required reading for anybody who wants to know about the history of the NACA and about engineering epistemology. In 1947, when Walter served as branch chief in the 1x3-foot supersonic tunnel, he was Jack Boyd's first boss. That's Jack Boyd sitting in the center there. Jack reported to work on January 15, 1947, joining Harvey Allen's famed high-speed aeronautics division, which included R.T. Jones, Al Eggers, Dean Chapman, and Walter Vincenti. In 1963, Allen, then associate director, asked Jack to be his technical assistant and marshal all of Ames' work into a coherent research program to support the booming Apollo program. Jack then rose through the managerial ranks at Ames, which included stints as associate administrator for management at NASA headquarters and deputy director for Dryden Research Center, now Armstrong. Today, still hard at work, Jack serves as senior advisor to the center director, OMSPUD, and senior advisor for history. In 1956, while Jack served as branch chief in the 6x6-foot supersonic tunnel, he was Vic Peterson's first boss. That's Vic sitting over there on the right. After graduating from Oregon State University, Vic Peterson joined Ames in 1956 as an aeronautical engineer focused on supersonic aerodynamics, and soon moved into research on vehicles entering atmospheres other than Earth's. In 1968, he got his first management assignment. By 1974, he became chief of the Thermo and Gas Dynamics Division, responsible for the center's suite of research in high-speed wind tunnels, arc jets, ballistic ranges, and supercomputers. In 1990, he was appointed deputy director at Ames, where he served until retiring in 1994. He was an early advocate for the Numeric Aerodynamic Simulation Facility, the NAS, and in his post-Ames years, he served on numerous boards and study groups related to our nation's supercomputing capabilities. So here's how the panel will proceed. Jack will give a short presentation on the history and accomplishments of the NACA to give you some background. Then Walt and Vic will give some opening comments, and we will open the floor for questions. But first, our friends at Glenn Research Center, previously named the Lewis Research Center after the first research director of the NACA, sent us a video statement on the importance of the NACA from someone who would know. Simon Ostrich joined the NACA Aircraft Engine Research Laboratory in Cleveland in 1944. In 1960, he moved to the Case Institute of Technology to lead its work in heat transfer and fluid physics to support a variety of NASA missions. So let's see the video.
I'm Simon Ostrach, and I came to the Aircraft Engine Research Laboratory of NACA in Cleveland in June of 1944. The problems we confronted then were problems due to the war effort, specifically engine problems for various aircraft. We attacked those problems in the usual sort of semi-empirical ways. After the war, we started to do research on the next type of propulsion system, whether it be a turbojet or turboprop. And about this time, my branch chief had suggested that I go to graduate school and get a PhD. That thought had never entered my mind, but I did follow up with that. And from 1947 to 1950, I went to graduate school and got a PhD in applied mathematics at Brown University. When I came back, there was just a flurry of real research being done by very smart people, and the environment could not have been better any place for a postdoc. Then when NASA was established, there started to be a big cultural change, and that the problems of the space program were very different from the problems that we had confronted at NACA. And so the personnel started turning more to being program managers than research people. And a lot of the good research people started to leave for industry and academia. And I left in 1960 to become a professor at Case Western Reserve University, where I was for 45 years. NASA is quite a very different organization than NACA was, in that most of the people are program managers, and at least at what is now the Glenn Research Center, research is not the #1 priority, and that, I think, is the major difference.
Thank you to Cy for those comments. And now Jack, would you like to?
You'll be up there, I assume.
Yes.
Okay. First, I got to get up there.
Across the stage.
Okay. Thanks, Glenn. Before I talk a little bit about NACA and some of the things we did, I'd like to make two other out-of-the-box comments. Some of the people who talked about NACA from the old days, one of them was a guy named Abe Silverstein. Can you hear me? Can you hear? And he was a director at Lewis, which is now Glenn. He said, NACA has one big problem. He said, Langley gets all the money, Lewis gets all the people, and Ames gets all the brains. And it's been that way ever since, okay? And the other point was that if you worked, the reason NACA works so well, they say, this guy says, is that it has a committee. It was run by a committee of about 12 people, which meets once a year and gives out money and then goes away and leaves you alone. Would it be that way this time? I don't know. I doubt it. But anyway, that's the way we'll start out. Let's go with the first chart. There are a few word charts here. I'll give you time to read them, but this just tells you how NAC was really established in March 3rd, 1915, so 100 years ago in March. And it was established simply to do aeronautical research. When you think about it, the Wright brothers flew in 1903, and not before 1903, actually, there was a lot of things going on around the world in developing aircraft. After 1903, we didn't do very much, this country. There was a lot going on overseas still. And I think somebody got worried about it and said, you need some focused area to do research on aircraft so we can catch up with the other people. And so they decided to set up this NACA committee. And it was devoted to looking at the problems, very simply, the problems of aircraft with a focus on how to solve them. That was a simple question that was posed. And the next chart gives you a little more detail on how that, next chart. That's a simple statement of the chart of NACA. And it was done deliberately with Langley coming along in 1917 to do aeronautical research. It was many years later, actually, quite a lot, before it was decided to have a second laboratory, Ames. And this second laboratory was set up because Charles Lindbergh was really concerned about what they were doing in Europe. And he came back and told the president this. And the president said, well, we should have if you think we should have a second lab, where? And he gave him the job of finding out. And Lindbergh went around the country and found this semi-empty naval base. It wasn't totally empty, but there were 2,000 acres here, and only about 500 were being used by the Navy. And the Navy had the large hangar that you see over there, and the Macon dirigible flew out of that large hangar. It was built for the Macon. It was about 800 feet long, enormous vehicle. And it was funny, the interesting to aero engineers was that it had these little biplanes that went up inside it. And when it wanted to fly away and do surveying, they would let them down on a hook. They would fly away. When they finished, they'd come back and hook back on. And these little biplanes did this for about a year and a half, and the Macon crashed off the coast of California. And that was kind of the end of the big Zeppelin days. It crashed in 1935. But that just shows you the centers then were formed. As I said, Ames in 39, then Lewis came along in 40, and Dryden came along in 46, and those were the four centers for NASA. Next chart is a little bit more about that. This is the committee I mentioned that Lindbergh chaired. I understand that at some point, people said, why don't you name it Lindbergh Research Center? But that never worked out. Ames, Dr. Ames was a very prominent individual and the chairman of NACA. He never got a chance to come and visit Ames, but they named the center after him. He was the president of Johns Hopkins University as well as the chairman of NACA. The next chart, here we go again. This gives you a timeline so you can see how the centers were formed. Dr. Ames here at Ames. Then in 58, these four centers were in existence here. That was it. And they were incorporated into NASA right away. And the way NACA worked was really quite independent in this sense. They were given a job to do to develop research and technology for improving air transportation. And they were kind of left alone to do it. I forgot to mention that the first budget of NACA when it was formed was like $5,000. $5,000 a year was the first budget. Now, there wasn't a center then, and it wasn't until 1917, but that activity started, and the many things that happened, which I'll briefly mention before I quit here, before NASA was formed, toward the end in the 50s, we started looking and worrying about the fact that we someday may go into space, so we needed to do something other than just develop highly swept wings, very thin wings, what have you. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. Now, the next chart, interesting the way NACA worked in terms of its data transfer. As a wind tunnel jockey, I recall we would take data in our supersonic wind tunnel, lift, drag, pitching moment, what have you, for different shaped aircraft, triangular wing aircraft, swept back wing, unswept wings. And almost before we finished getting the data, the industry would settle in here and actually take it away with them sometimes. We published our own reports, NACA reports, which were very famous and very popular with the aircraft industry. And the industry, that was why we were set up, to improve the aeronautical activities of this country, and the industry took advantage of us being here. By then, the four centers were developing an enormous amount of information in various ways. And to get it out to them quickly, we had what we call technical inspections. They weren't called conferences, though some people put that name on it. The inspections were such that we would invite industry and the academic folks to come and visit us. We'd make presentations to them on the data we had accumulated perhaps only a month earlier, sometimes 3 or 4. And they would see what we had done and want it right away. And this is why the aircraft industry was so, I guess, taken with the fact that NACA was there to give them free data. Now, we didn't charge them for the data. We put it out in reports, and they took it away with them. That's kind of the way we disseminate information. Next chart. This is one of the inspections that was held. Now, most of you young people are much, much too young to remember any of these people. But Dr. von Karman was one of the most famous aerodynamicists in the world, and he was in this country working at Caltech. These are some of the other people. Jimmy Doolittle, whose name you might recall. He did the flight off the deck of a carrier into Japan. He was a member of NACA, though. Another interesting thing about him, he got the first PhD degree from MIT, actually. Anyway, these are the kind of people that were on there. This young fellow here, you see him? That's the guy sitting up here to my left. Vic was too young to be on here. He wasn't even here yet. I think he came in, 53 or 54. Otherwise, I'd have him here. R.T. Jones and Harvey Allen, which I'll talk a little bit about later, were two of the most famous aerodynamicists in the world, not just in this country or at the center, but in the whole world. But that's the kind of things that we had to, I recall this one, particular one, and I was involved with it. Here I am, you can't recognize me, but that's me. In the 50s, it was in 1950, and I remember it vividly because that's the year we got married, and we almost didn't because I was getting ready for this conference. And she said, if you're going to pay that much attention to the conference, what's going to happen after we're married? I said, I guess it'll be the same thing. But anyway, we celebrated our 65th wedding anniversary, so it worked. Next chart. These are some of the major, I got 2 charts here on contributions. Now, you look at these carefully, you won't recognize some of the activity. This is all of NACA, not just Ames. Ames will come a little bit later. The cowling, which reduced the drag on aircraft, was developed at Langley Research Center. The whole series of airfoils, which was the way the wings were formed, were developed, again, at the Langley Research Center. Icing research, which was very, very active in the 30s and 40s, was started here by a guy who got the Collier Trophy and who moved to Glenn later. The swept-back wing, this was an interesting story. Dr. Vincenti may challenge me on what I say here because I've never gotten it totally straight. R.T. Jones started at Langley Field and started the concept of sweeping wings back to reduce the drag, improve the lift-to-drag ratio. He came to Ames in the early 40s himself and continued that work. Now, I understand at Langley Field, when he first got the concept, they wouldn't let him publish the data because they thought he was crazy. So why sweep a wing back? Well, he proved that, that his concept was right. Now, what really happened then, a fellow in Germany by the name of Bussmann was developing a swept-back wing at the very same time RT was. Because of the wartime, they weren't permitted to talk to each other. So they developed it separately, and both of them became famous for having this done. Now, this is on every aircraft now that flies in the world that flies above 400 or 500 miles an hour. And at the end of the war, Bussmann came over to the University of Colorado, and he and RT became very good friends. And Mach 1 supersonic at Dryden, this guy's name is Chuck Yeager. 1947 is the year he broke the sound barrier at Dryden. Transonic area rule, which again is changing the shape of the fuselage at the root of the wing to reduce the drag. This was done by a man named Whitcomb at Langley Field. This is something I worked on with this young fellow here called conical camber. It was another way to reduce the lag, improve the L/D ratio of triangular swept-back wings. For interesting story here. I was a project manager in the 6x6 wind tunnel on this project. A gentleman from the outside in the Air Force by the name of Duchendorf was the project manager, and he came to Ames quite often, and we tested this thing together. It was put on the B-58 bomber, actually, a beautiful bomber, Mach 2 bomber. He was bring 2 little boys along with him, named Ron and John, and it turned out 10 years later, 15 years later, he called me and said, "I'm going to the city to hear my son sing. Do you want to come?" I said, "Yeah, but who's your son?" He said, "His name is Denver." He changed his name from Duchendorf to John Denver. So that's how we got to know John Denver. Now, the last thing on there is a reentry technology. It's a blunt body. Another gentleman here thought, okay, we're going Mach 2, 3, 4. You want sharp wings, swept-back wings, but if you're going really fast, like orbiting the Earth or coming back from the moon, you'll be going 25,000 miles an hour, and you want to make sure you don't burn the thing up. And therefore, make the body blunt to take the heat away, and it'll survive that way. He developed the blunt body concept, which itself, again, is on every vehicle goes in any atmosphere. Next chart, I think I'm about finished. Next chart. No, skip that one, go. I'll finish that, keep going, we've done that enough. These are all too long, let's go, keep going. Keep going, we've talked about that, done that, done that, done that. Okay, that's it, keep going. That's what we do. Here's the legacy that lives on in NASA from NACA. How we work in partnership with the industry. We do it with industry, universities around the world, not just in this country. And what we do is research on solving problems related to aircraft and spacecraft flight. And who we hire? Brilliant, inquisitive folks like all you in the room. If you turn out to be inquisitive and bright enough and want to, we might hire you like 10 years from now when you finish your. And the next and last chart, if that's not the last one, that's it. Okay, that's all I've got to say about it. And okay.
And now, Walter, it's your turn. Walter, it's your turn to talk. If we could hear a few minutes of reminiscences from you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Glenn.
It's time for you to talk.
What?
Talk.
Well,
Time for you to talk to the folks.
they tell me it's all right if I talk sitting here. I want to thank you, Glenn, for inviting me to do this. At my age of 98, it's a pleasure to be able to participate. I was employed here at the Ames Research Center on June 1st of 1940, which is almost exactly 75 years ago. I was very fortunate to have that position. Ames was just started. I was the 4th engineer on the staff. The 3 ahead of me had come from Langley Field, Virginia, which was the NACA's National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Space hadn't been invented yet. And there were 3 people from Langley Field, and I was the 4th person hired. I had just finished my 2 years of graduate work at Stanford. It was fortunate that Ames was being put here. It was interesting that the NACA wanted to establish a laboratory on the Pacific Coast to supplement their original laboratory at Langley Field, Virginia. And the aircraft industry was very much concentrated in Los Angeles, and they wanted the laboratory down there. as did the people at Caltech. But the people in Washington thought that to be right next door to the industry would be asking for visitors every day, because all the people in the aircraft companies would have to do would be to get in their car and drive for an hour or so, and they'd be at the laboratory. So they wanted to be on the Pacific coast, but to be an overnight trip from Los Angeles was attractive. So they decided to put the laboratory here at Moffett Field, which at that time was just the base for the dirigible hangar behind us here, and a naval base, and about a half a dozen buildings. So when I came here on June the 1st of 1940, the Ames laboratory consisted of a construction shack. That was all there was, no paved roads. It was off to the north side of the naval base. And there was a half-built flight hangar, and that was it. The staff consisted of 3 people from Langley Field, and I was the 4th person on the staff. So I grew up with the Ames laboratory. My work in the first years was largely construction work on the first wind tunnels, 2 7 by 10 foot subsonic tunnels, the high-speed 16-foot tunnel, and that was it. The 40 by 80 full-scale tunnel was under construction, as were the 8 7 by 10, and so I participated for the first years in construction. Then, after about 3 years of that, we started to work in doing research in supersonic flow, which in those days was almost unheard of. The only people who had done anything in supersonics were the Germans. The only literature we had to go on were publications from Germany. And so we were largely on our own. I was fortunate to be in charge of the first supersonic tunnel to be built here. It was one of the first 2 supersonic tunnels to be built in the United States. The other one being at the naval base on the East Coast. And as I say, all we had to go on was what publications we could find from Germany. So we were on our own, and I was put in charge of the first supersonic tunnel, and I had a staff of about 20 engineers working with me. And we were very fortunate in the engineers that we had. Of those 20 or so engineers, 4 of them were project engineers, and I met with my project engineers every Friday afternoon, and we would have a discussion. The kind of thing we was doing had no supervision from the front office. They knew less about supersonic flow than we did, and we learned it as we went along and made it up. I had a group of 4 project engineers. Of the 5 of us who met every Friday afternoon to discuss what we were doing and learn about supersonics from each other, 3 of them had bachelor's degrees, no PhDs, one had a master's degree, and I had 2 years for an engineer's degree from Stanford. And that was all that we had as background. We had no supervision from the front office because, as I believe I said, they knew less about supersonic flow than we did, and we simply learned about it as we went along. In our every Friday afternoon, we had a meeting of the project engineers and taught each other what we had learned in the preceding week. Now these, as I say, these people were, none of us had PhDs. After the war, 3 of the 5 of us went back to Caltech and got PhDs, and then came back to work here at Ames. They were names that you might have run across: Dean Chapman, Milton Van Dyke, and Jack Nielsen. These were very remarkable people. Of the 5 of us, 4 of us went on and became members of the National Academy of Engineering. The other one dropped out of aeronautics and became a member of the people here in the valley who were fostering the new Silicon Valley corporations, and he probably made more money than the other 4 of us put together, who, as I say, became members of the National Academy.
You might note that R.T. Jones, that I mentioned, didn't have a degree at all.
Yes, R.T. Jones, who came out here from Langley Field, only, and this he didn't have at the time, his only college degree was an honorary doctor's degree, which he got from the University of Colorado at the behest of Adolphe Boussaman. So he was a remarkable person. He had an office right across the hall from me, and R.T. and I got to know each other quite well and worked together. But my time already? Well, I could go on reminiscing for the rest of the hour, but
We can do it over cocktails.
it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
And for those of you who would like to know more, of course, you can read Walter's book. The NASA History Office did a series of oral history interviews with all 3 of these gentlemen. And if you go to the NASA History Office webpage and look under oral history interviews, you can see more of their comments there. And now, Victor.
Oh, yes. Oh, good. Well, I'll try to be brief because I know the time is a little short. I was a student at Oregon State University back in the early to mid 50s, and I was in the aeronautical engineering program. And at that time, NACA was an obscure organization. If you stopped anybody on the street and said you were thinking about working at NACA, they would not have idea at all of what that meant. And in fact, when I was getting ready to graduate, all of the action was in the Southern California aircraft companies. The first supersonic airplane flight, level flight, was the F-100 in 1953. And there was a big race going on to see which company down there could come up with a design for the next supersonic military fighter. So all of the students, when they were thinking about places to work, they only thought about LA and the aircraft companies. Well, it turns out that the senior class, we had a small class of about 15 people in aeronautical engineering. The senior class arranged to have a recruiting field trip down to LA to look at these companies. And on the way down, we stopped at Ames and had a tour. And so when I planted my foot on first time at Ames, I said, this is where I want to work, even though I had not seen the rest. So anyway, went on the field trip, and all I saw was rooms of hundreds of engineers in a room sitting at drafting tables, working on little pieces of a design of an aircraft. And so I thought to myself, what do I want to do? Do I want to do that, or do I want to come to this university campus here? So I applied to come to Ames and was hired, and never regretted it. The reason most people didn't come to an organization like Ames or Langley at that time was their tremendous salary differential. I turned down starting salaries of more than twice what I could get here. And most of the kids at that time were thinking about the money and took the jobs in industry. So I graduated in '56 and came to Ames, and my first assignment was to work in the 6x6 foot supersonic tunnel, it was called. And actually it was the premier facility almost for that era, because it had a continuously variable Mach number range from 0.6 Mach number up to 2.2. And you could test all the way through this transonic speed range, which was really giving the companies the fits. How do we get through that transonic speed range, build an airplane that will still have enough power to go on at higher Mach numbers? First day I came in, I was given a personal computer. And the personal computer was a 20-inch K&E slide rule. The real computers at Ames in those days were rooms full of mostly women sitting at mechanical calculators and pounding away all day long, 8 hours a day, day after day. And that was our computing power back in those days. Most new engineers, when they came in, if they were assigned to a wind tunnel operation facility, the first 6 months you were expected to learn all about the wind tunnel and how to operate it and all that sort of stuff. And we used to complain to our managers at the time, why do we have to do this? We went to college to get a degree and do aeronautical research, and now we're running a wind tunnel. And it turned out that was the most wise thing that could have happened, because in order to develop a good experiment for a facility, you first have to understand very carefully what the capabilities of that facility are and how it worked and that sort of thing. So after the 6 months, then we could go on and do our research. But at that time, it was also quite different from Ames today, in the sense that every position at Ames was a government job. There were absolutely no contract positions. We didn't have really any student program in the summer. The guards at the gate were civil servants. The people that swept the floors, the people that delivered the mail, the shop people, everybody was a government worker. There were so our staff was actually quite small at that time. It was between, I think, around 800 to 1,000 people at Ames at that time. Anyway, I started off doing work on looking at possible supersonic aircraft configurations, and studied a lot of configurations that had either swept wings or straight wings or triangular wings, and all kinds of different vertical tail and horizontal tail configurations and control surfaces. we didn't have travel to professional meetings and that sort of thing at that time. And all of our work was pretty much reported in either the NACA technical notes or the technical reports. And these reports were meticulously reviewed before they could be published. Every report that came along, a review committee would be set up, 5 or 6 people. That review committee would go through everything in the report, make sure it all held together and made sense. We transferred our information, as Jack mentioned, largely through visits from aircraft companies. The aircraft companies would come here, tell us what their problems were, and we would tell them what we were working on that could help with those problems. Well, then NASA came along in '58, and immediately some of us started to think, well, how can we've been working in supersonic aerodynamics, what can we do to support the space program? So a number of us started to think about, well, what are the atmospheres of the other planets? They're not air. What are they made up of? You know, it turned out carbon dioxide, nitrogen, that sort of thing. So we asked ourselves the question, well, what would the aerodynamics of a vehicle flying in those gases, how would it differ from flying in the atmosphere of air? And we started to learn all about the properties of these gases, and we even went so far as to fill up a couple of the smaller wind tunnels with carbon dioxide and nitrogen gas mixtures to try to see what the compare what we measured with what we had calculated. After the beginning of NASA, of course, there was a big frenzy to build a whole bunch of new facilities. And the 3.5-foot hypersonic wind tunnel came along and was built. The arc jet complex for the high-speed materials testing work came along, and there was a lot of work on shock tubes development, and the ballistics ranges, new ballistics ranges were put into force where you could fire models at hypersonic speeds in the range and measure its performance as it flew along. So a lot of new facilities. We went from, NACA was a few thousand people in '58, and at the peak of NASA there were 400,000 people on the NASA payroll. So it was quite an expansion from a couple thousand to 400,000 at the peak. It was interesting, and that's when NASA came along is when we could finally start to go to technical meetings and present our work on the outside. Prior to that, at Ames, before NASA, it was even difficult to make a phone call outside the base. In the 6-by-6-foot wind tunnel, we had 2 phones, one in the hallway on the first floor, one in the hallway on the second floor. And if you received a call or wanted to make a call, you had to go out to the hall, stand in the hall and talk. And you couldn't call off center without going through the center's operator. There was an operator that handled all the phone transmissions in and out of the center. So transferring information was a little tedious, and it was really all done through the reports. You write the reports, and they were published, and people read them, hopefully. At that time, my work started to shift from then aerodynamics in the Earth's atmosphere to aerodynamics in the atmospheres of like Mars and Venus, and that sort of thing. And I got also interested in the motions of vehicles flying at high speeds in these other atmospheres, and did a lot of work on what happens if you have a planetary probe type vehicle and you just threw it into an atmosphere, tumbling it in a random way. Would it straighten out, get nose first, heat shield first, and then go on down through and make a successful entry? And so I studied the tumbling bodies, and that brought on the use of large-scale computer programs, because when you're solving the 6th degree of freedom's equations of motion, you can't do it with paper and pencil. You have to do it on a computer. And the first computer at Ames was the real computer, was the IBM 650. And you'd write up your equations. The girls would punch in the equations in punch cards. You'd send the punch cards over to the computer. The program ran so long, it would take all night long. They wouldn't run it during the day because it tied up the whole machine for 8 or 10 hours. And so I'd get a case ready to go, send it over. They'd run it through the machine. Next day, they would come back. The answers, there would be a mistake. So you go back through and you find out where the problem was, repunch the card, send it back over, and you went through this cycle a number of times. So that was kind of fun. So today, there's quite a world of difference between what it was like to work with NACA in the 50s and early 60s. And now, of course, if somebody asks you where you work, you say you work for NASA, everybody knows. They say you're a rocket scientist. And they didn't know what NACA was in my day. I think NACA laid the foundation for a lot of the culture that's in NASA today in terms of very careful work, making sure everything was right before you published it. And when we were going on into the space program, you couldn't afford any mistakes. And so I think the early culture of NACA of doing meticulous research and meticulous checking of everything helped to make the space program as successful as it has been. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vic. We'll have time for just one or two questions, but let me start with a question, and that is, did the NACA miss space? Were you so focused on the work that you were doing in aerodynamics that by 1958 the NACA did not have any work going in the space program, or had you anticipated that the aerospace regime would expand from the atmosphere into space?
I think there was some anticipation of it. As I recall, before NASA was officially formed, there were some groups formed called, I think, Space Task Groups. And select people from Ames, Langley, and Lewis, and probably the Flight Center, were put together and they started to do the advanced thinking about, how should we start. The president by that time had said we have to go to the moon in this decade. So those were the marching orders. And this Space Task Group then met largely in different disciplines. And the structures people would talk about, what do they have to do, the aero people, the heating people, et cetera. So there was a buildup, maybe starting, I'd say, a year before NASA.
I think in response to that, I think in the early 50s, Harvey Allen got us started thinking about going into space with his blunt body concept. So we were thinking 5-6 years before we became NASA that we were going to be going out there, actually. And one other comment I want to make, Vic made a good point of things we did and didn't do. I'll quit after this. The famous saying in the space group that failure is not an option. Well, in developing technology of any kind and doing science, failure is an option because you take risk. If you don't take risk, you don't get anywhere. So it's true you don't take it with human life, but you sure as hell do in technology. You take risks. So you guys should do that. Think about that anyway. That's it.
Okay, now if anybody from the audience would like to move to the microphone and ask their own question. And while we're waiting, let me say that I'm glad that all three of you talked about the importance of communication, about the inspections, and about the NACA publication program, which really was very unique and different from how NASA people today present their work. But let me ask you a little bit about two leaders here, Harvey Allen and Smith DeFrance. DeFrance was center director for 25 years until 1965. Harvey Allen worked here until 1970. What impact did they have on the NACA? Jack, why don't you start?
Well, Smitty was he built Ames. He built wind tunnels, he built arc jets, was here for 25 years, and that was his main goal in life, to build things. And he was very good at it because they taught him at Langley Field. And who else?
Harvey Allen and Smith de France.
Well, Harvey was influential, I think, around the world in the research he did. Nobody wanted to think of the blunt body as a concept that would be valuable in space, except he did. And he had the support of some of the folks like the astronomers. Fred Whipple was an astronomer, and they would view what happened to these vehicles, the asteroids as they came into Earth, and they found a lot of the pieces were blunt shapes. And he figured, intuitively, why is that? And he worked back and got the aerodynamics worked out right. And that's how he got to his blunt shape, and affected enormously around the world, I think, space exploration. You got a question back there.
So I guess the one thing that kind of is, if you had one thing that you could transplant that you had in the NACA that you think is missing from the NASA culture today, what is that one thing that you would, transplant from NACA to NASA?
The ability to take risks in research and technology. We have, is this being recorded, isn't it? I would be careful. We have so many constraints sometimes from different places and different folks that you're afraid to take risks as they are. And I think that goes all the way through the ranks back to Congress. They don't want failure, they just can't accept failure. And you've got to accept some risks like that. I would think that is a point we should keep in mind as you guys go along in your careers. Vic? Where'd you go?
Okay. Okay, Jonas.
Is there somebody else? Oh, I got a phone-in message, basically a question. Questions from John Livasich, and he was wondering about a Japanese Zero that was captured in Alaska during World War II, and he was wondering whether or not it was actually tested here at Ames.
I'm sorry, Japanese what?
Japanese Zero,
Zero airplane.
the aircraft.
Yeah, what about it now?
Was there one tested here? Was one tested here? Was it brought over to Ames?
Not to my knowledge, there wasn't. No.
If you gentlemen don't remember, I'm sure we've got something written in the archive where we can answer John's question
Okay.
if he contacts us.
Thank you.
Okay, last question.
So in considering the formation of NASA, I always had the notion that there were 4 organizations that were part of that, and you've represented the 4 NACA centers, but I always thought that significant representation from Goddard's rocketry program and from the Redstone Arsenal work that Werner von Braun had been doing, as well as some Air Force work down at Dryden, well, down into Edwards Air Force Base, were other organizations that got rolled up into the NASA entity. And so my question to you is, first of all, is that true? And second, how much of that heritage actually made it into NASA as well? As I work with the range organizations, and I think of those as Dryden and Wallops, there seems to be quite a different philosophy, a more rocketry-oriented philosophy in those guys than we see at a lot of the other centers.
The base in Marshall became where the rockets were being built, got rolled into NASA. In a sense, JPL got rolled into NASA eventually, a bit later than the others. So, and the JPL folks had been focusing on military activities of various kinds. Those are the 2 that I know of, got rolled into NASA. There may be others.
You mentioned Goddard. Goddard Space Flight Center wasn't created until well after NASA was created. So
More of Goddard, the rocket scientist, and his
Goddard.
work.
Okay.
And did that all get captured?
Well, that
into
came
the
in
NASA
through von
organization?
Braun.
Through von Braun.
Werner von Braun and his group of, 20 or 30 people were brought over from Germany after the war, and they became the nucleus of the Marshall
And I think
Center.
a piece of the Navy Vanguard activity got rolled into it as well.
The Navy activity, yeah. But NACA had the predominance of the workforce, and so NACA owned the predominance of the culture.
Yeah. Incidentally, you should never say NACA to a NACA person. Because at Langley Field, they used to be called the NACA nuts, around the community, so.
Well, thank you all for listening, and thank you, Walter and Jack and Vic, for speaking with us.